Hello and welcome, I'm Kayla Scrivener. Are you ready for a long one? Because we're going to be reading Victorian literature. Well, not actually, but we're going to be talking about reading Victorian literature, which is something I'm so much better at than actually reading Victorian literature. It is a talent, an ability, a thing. I can talk about books I've never read with so much more preciseness and profoundness than some of the books that I've actually read, because then I get conflicted because I'm like, there's so many thoughts and so many nuances. And what if I get it wrong? But if I'm not educated about it, I can just talk about it wonderfully. But with that introduction out of the way, I'm going to be talking about a long-term Victorian TBR. This is something that I saw Katie from Books and Things do a while ago, and I really loved it. She's much better read, and I think almost every book on this list she's read. A lot of these have been on my list for a really long time, but I'm feeling like the Victorian vibes. I tend to be a classic reader. I really love classic books, but I do tend to gear more toward the 20th century than the Victorian era, and even the Victorian era I tend to go more into American and Canadian books. So there is, I think, only 26 Victorian books I've ever read. Just finished David Copperfield, and I finished it and I was like, wow, I really want to like dive more into all of this world. And then I was like thinking about Dickens books and I was like, do I have another 34 hours of an audiobook on me right now? No. So I'm just going to make a list and talk about it. First of all, I have a lot of Charles Dickens. Throughout, I'm going to be going through and talking about different authors and going through kind of the books that I hope to read. And then I'm also going through some individual authors where I only know one or two books or I haven't read them at all. And yeah, hopefully this is fun. Hopefully this is interesting. If you've read these books, if you think there's books that I should highlight or not highlight or like, avoid with the things, like there's some authors which I will not be mentioning because I've read their books and I don't like them very much. But there's some that I'm super excited to read. And I love getting into the spirit. Also, when I say long term, I mean like long term. Like, it's like the next 10 years. It's gonna be a while, especially with like these Dickens. I think I've read like a Dickens a year and I think that that's like nice. And there's like 7 on here. I might read more Thomas Hardy and stuff like that. I don't know. So first of all, Charles Dickens, I read A Christmas Carol, A Tale of Two Cities, and David Copperfield, all of which I have enjoyed middlingly. I'm not a huge fan. I'm not a huge scorner. I'm not sure he's an author that I'm going to be like ever in love with, but I'm still enticed to read more. So first of all, we have Great Expectations, which is just embarrassing because I started the book when I was like 14. I still remember like the torn out copy. I have like a lot of Dickens right behind me because every time I see a Dickens book, I'm like, yes, I'm going to read that one day. And I think I will. And yeah, this is about Pip. He's down on his luck. He's orphaned and it's another first person, which David Copperfield, I liked less so because it was first person. So we'll be interested. And then we have Dombey and Son, which is about a daughter who is neglected for her brother, who is definitely not as good of a person or businessman as her. Then we have little Dorrit, who was born in jail and was raised there in her experience. Charles Dickens' parents were in jail with a lot of his younger siblings and he visited them there, and that's where that story comes from. Then we have The Old Curiosity Shop, which I honestly don't know much about, but it's an awesome name. Don't you want to read that? Like, I'm just reading The Old Curiosity Shop. It's going to be lovely. That is what I'm imagining, and sorry for the British accent. And then we have Oliver Twist, which I've heard controversial things about, but I don't care. It's one of the classics. And then Bleak House, in which there's many fogs, apparently, and there's inheritance and love, and I kind of honestly want to read all of Dickens, or like at least all the well-known ones, just because I feel like that would be epic. Sometimes, like, I just did a whole like Instagram posts and stuff about how we like sometimes look grandly on books of the past that we wouldn't look on grandly now, and like I can critique it and be like, it's kind of silly and we should not like, put them on a pedestal just because they're old books doesn't make them hard or really serious. But also I'm like, I want to be that person who's like read all of Dickens, even if I don't like Dickens. I don't know. You can judge me if you can. And then we have Thomas Hardy. I did also just finish one of his books, which was Mayor of Casterbridge. It's definitely my least favorite of the books that I've read so far. By no means is like a bad book. I very much enjoyed it. I liked the characters. I thought that it wasn't quite as introspective and it had a little more dramatics going on for the sake of dramatics. He himself said he wished he had like toned it down and like done some more introspection, and that is definitely something that could have aided the plot but definitely did not ruin the plot. And then I've also read Tess of The D'Urbervilles as well as Madding Crowd, and both of them I really enjoyed. And then for books that I'm really excited to read by Thomas Hardy, I really want to read The Hand of Ethelberta. This is like a not very well known, but it is the book that I think I first heard about Thomas Hardy, and I was like, I've been wanting to read him ever since. It's just like very unknown. But pretty much the idea is this woman who like, she remakes herself into this noblewoman and no one knows that she's like really poor. And all that sold me on this is there's a scene in which she is being served and the waiter is her father, but she can't acknowledge that it is her father because that would admit that she was low born. And I just want to see that plot. I want to see those. That is like the kind of interesting class discussion that I really love. We have Jude the Obscure, which is a book that I started last year and I really enjoyed it. I just didn't get a lot in and I got distracted with school. And then we have the Woodlanders, which is like an insular community impacted by the greater world. And then yeah, I think I kind of want to read all of his books. I just won't list them all, but those are the ones that I have like put on the thing to read the closest. And then we have Henry James, who, I don't know, I think I just have a crush on him. I don't know why. I just like, every time I think about him, I smile so much. He's one of the authors that I read first from the Victorian era, even though there's like a little asterisk there because he wasn't Victorian in the strictly Victorian way. He's American, but he did spend almost his entire adult life in Victorian England and in Edwardian England after it. And he got his British citizenship, I think 6 months before he died. Like, it was, you know, he got to be British by like immigration and also by experience and stuff like that. But a lot of his books deal with the slice between American and European sensibilities and ethics and stuff like that. And Daisy Miller is a book I've read twice, and it's super interesting, and I love the discussion of it and the ways in which he does it. And The Turn of the Screw is just such a great book. I've also read it twice. Like, I've only read 2 of his books, but both of them I've read multiple times, and it's just a fascinating book. It's actually the basis of The Haunting of Bly Manor, which is something that people might know more in popular culture, but it's also one of the most debated books of all time. I really like Bly Manor. It definitely did different things in the book, but both of them are brilliant, and it was just really, really lovely, and I can't wait to read more of his books. We have The Portrait of a Lady, which is an American not lady who gets ushered into Victorian society, and she has to kind of like figure out what the heck is going on. And then we have Washington Square, which feels like it actually is in the US, but it's like someone who is poor and plain, and they have a rich suitor. Sometimes my notes don't make a lot of sense when there's just like a million things on this page. And The Bastards is a bunch of Americans living in Paris. This one actually came out after the Victorian era, but I don't care. I'm putting all his stuff in here together because, you know, he's primarily Victorian. And then also The Awkward Age, which sneaks into the Victorian era in 1899, and it's about this girl who is just awkward courting age. And I remember, I think this is the first book that I knew by him, and I was like, I'm gonna read this book. It's gonna be so cool. It's gonna be fascinating. It's just like, I was only about 19 or something when I experienced this book title for the first time, and this like awkward girl sitting on the front, and me being like, teenagers, they've always been teenagers, even when there's cool courting things going on. So that was my fascination with him, and I'm super excited to read that book. We're moving on to another author that I really, really love, like almost outrageously for the amount of much that I've read. I read Cranford, which is a delightful book. I read it like years ago and don't remember much of it, and then I read it last year and I loved it. It fits my vibe. It fits what I want in a book so much. It's just all of these ladies just chilling around the world, just telling stories, talking about old lovers, you know, burning letters, and I don't know. It's cozy. It's cottagecore. It's so funny. Like, the first line is like, you know, what is the place? Oh yeah, Cranford. It's like, Cranford is owned by the Amazons, for a man has never shown up, and when a man shows up, he always ends up in Grafton, which is 2 miles away. And, you know, misfortune always happens. I'm not sure if it's Grafton, that's like my improvisation of the first line, but it is so great. It's so funny. Anyways, I really am excited to read more of her books. Obviously, North and South is in there. She is super, super well known for this book. It is often compared to like the 1850s version of Pride and Prejudice. It has these people who are from very different classes and social things. One of them is coming from the North, one of them is coming from the South, one of them is industrial. I believe that they're in the more industrialized version, and if I knew more about British landscape, I would know better, but I think it's the North. Be the South. But pretty much it's these people who have prejudices and have things and have lots of banter, and it's gonna be great. Wives and Daughters, which apparently she died very suddenly at the end of it, and the person she was staying with finished it, but it sounds interesting. And then we have Ruth, which I'm super excited about because it's like one of my favorite tropes, or like things I enjoy in literature in general. It feels weird to say this is a favorite trope because it is not fun, but Ruth is about a woman who is poor, and she's a seamstress, and she's young, and she has a rich suitor who is like, ooh, I like you, you can come stay with me. And then he abandons her, and that means that she needs to be slut-shamed by her society, and she can't do anything, so now she has to figure out life. And that sounds about good. Not that I want it to happen in real life, but it's interesting to deal with the ways in which social things have changed and the ways in which women are perceived and not perceived in society is really great. Mary Barton is about a woman whose father is accused of murder, and she has to like deal with the repercussions. I feel like Elizabeth Gaskell is like, let's deal with like social outcomes and like the things in which people frown on, and it's gonna be great. It's gonna be great. Anyways, I'm really excited for this. Apparently it's also based on a real life murder in which someone murders something. And then we have My Lady Ludlow, which is about the mistress of Hanbury and the ways in which they think that she's not changing, and yet she will change. I don't know what that means at all. Now we're gonna go into a few single books before going into some of the longer ones. Again, we need to change up the rhythm and make sure, you know, you're paying attention. We have Jill by Amy Dillwyn, and this is a gentleman's woman who disguises herself as a maid and like goes and does life. And it is also a very queer book that is like proto queer literature way back in like 1880s or 1890s, I think. And then we have Phantastes by George McDonald, and this is a collection of short stories and fairy tales that I am super, super excited for because Phantastes and George McDonald is like one of the leading inspirations to C.S. Lewis as well as Tolkien, and I am a huge, huge C.S. Lewis fan. You can't see that like all of these are the Narnia books up there. I love Narnia and I want to read the persons who inspired him. And then we have Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. It's like outlandish, it's a mystery, it's like a little gothic, I think. And then we're going back to an author I have read and whose books I want to read more of. And this is our fine fellow, Oscar Wilde. He is controversial because everyone is like, not only my favorite Victorian book, but my favorite book of all time. It's lyricism, it's beauty, it's wonder, it's questions. And I'm like, I was so bored and the pretentiousness practically killed me. And as someone who is like so pretentious, I am outrageously pretentious, but like you have to like change up your pretentiousness. You have to change up your pretentiousness. You have to change up your pretentiousness. You can't just like, you know, say the same thing, which is like, if this is this, then this is that. Pretty much. And what does not work in his novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, does work in his plays because they come off. I feel like because in theater, you're allowed to go bigger, you're allowed to go brighter, you're allowed to like have the boom and the bombast, and that works better in play. And these one little liners work better because someone's like walking around and doing stuff rather than just like saying like quippy lines but never having a conversation and being obsessed with youth. The fact that Dorian Gray is only 38 when he dies. Have you seen any photo of like anything of this like grizzled old man with this like hair like loose and long but also balding with like a face? Like I guess part of it is supposed to be sin, but the fact that we also put sin in old age and ugliness and deformity is definitely a huge, huge red flag because it's like so ableist, but it's also just dumb. Like I would not go back to looking like I did at 18. And as a woman who likes men, I also would not date an 18-year-old boy over a 38-year-old man. Like, I'm 25, so I'm kind of stuck between both of them, but I'm closer to the 18-year-old. But I would not make that choice. And the fact that these are like men in their 30s being like, yes, we're bemoaning our youth. And I'm like, what the heck is going on, dude? Anyways, I have a lot of issues with Dorian Gray, but his plays are wonderful. I read Lady Windermere's Fan, I read The Importance of Being Earnest, and they're both delightful. I had so much fun, so much delight. So here's some short stories and plays by him. We have The Canterville's Ghost, which is an American family who goes to a British town and house, and they have their own ghost, but they're more annoyed by it than anything. And this happened in Afterward as well, and Cara recommended this, and I think it's gonna be great. And then we have An Ideal Ghost, which is a blackmailing plot. It seems kind of similar to Lady Windermere's Fan, and it's a one act, and it sounds like it's gonna be really great. And then we have Salome, which is French. I did not know that Oscar Wilde was completely like literate and fluent in French to write plays in it, but he did, and it was scandalized. It was, you know, banned, all of these things because it is about seduction and vengeance and a bunch of other stuff. And then I'll probably read some of his poems, but I'm really, really excited to read The Ballad of Reading Gaol. I'm actually not sure if it's fiction or nonfiction, but I know that he wrote it in prison when he was imprisoned for gross indecency, i.e. being gay. And he was put there, and then he shortly died after because of the disastrous things, and he got pneumonia, tuberculosis. He got very ill because of the conditions that were there, and he wrote about it. And I think it's fiction, and I think it's going to be really delightful. That does not seem like the correct word, but like informative, good, I'm sure funny when also tragic, when also looking at the social things in the world, and I think it's going to be really, really great. I also have an ode to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, but I am less of a fan of him. I have read A Study in Starlet as well as The Sign of Four. They were both middling, but you know, you can't be like a Sherlock fan or like, you know, love those things without being like, I at least want to read some of his books, especially some of his really, really well-known books. So, of course, we have The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes and The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, which are both Victorian, and then we have The Hound of the Baskervilles, and then Valley of Fear and Last Bow are both technically Edwardian, or actually, are they past? It's so weird to me because like most of his Sherlock books take place in like the 1890s, 1880s, but like Arthur Conan Doyle didn't die until like the 1930s. It's one of those bizarre things. And then he went on and like wrote all those like science fiction books that are like more Jurassic Farm. There's like more which are more like Jurassic Park than anything. It's very interesting and very funny. And I don't know if I want to read those someday, but they're not Victorian. And then we have H.G. Wells, another man who wrote both. And I have only read his science fiction books, and I am intrigued. Another correct word. I have like liked and not liked some of his books. I'm not like overjoyed about them, but I have heard that his realist books can be more good, but I'm not sure if I'm committed to the bit enough for that. I have read The Invisible Man and The Time Machine, and both of them were good. I enjoyed them, I didn't love them, and then The Island of Dr. Moreau is an incredibly ableistic and racist book that I despise with my entire heart and think is trash. So yeah, whether I read The War of the Worlds or whether that ever happens really depends, because that book is disgusting. So I have it on my list because it might happen. On happier terms, we have The Diary of a Nobody by George and Whedon Grossman. This is a book that I started and I read the first like 20 pages and it's really delightful. Pretty much it is what it says, The Diary of a Nobody. It is a middle-class man and his wife and their life, and they're just living life as nobodies. And I don't think that gets turned on its head or satired in any way. It's just like, it's supposed to be satire in its own thing because it's just this basic life rather than this grand rich, which we always see people who are in like the greatest poverty, who of course rise up to the ranks, or people who are in great poverty already, or someone who is like middle class getting on the edge or something like that. Like, you know, you never super see someone who's just like middle class, you know. Anyways, so I'm really interested in reading more of it. And then we have Anthony Trollope, and I'm really excited to read more of his books. I read The Warden, which I absolutely loved. I've always been told that The Barchester Towers is like where you should start. The Warden is just like a small book you have to get over, and I disagree with my whole heart. The Warden was like perfectly length, it was succinct, it was introspective, it was so beautiful. The Barchester Towers was a little too bloated is the correct word. Like it had too many things added to it that were just not necessary for the plot. It was not necessarily for the characters. And I don't know, it is still very funny and I liked it, but he originally had a draft, and then when The Warden became a bestseller, he like added a bunch of things that I think didn't necessarily need to be added. Anyway, so I am slightly worried, but I have Dr. Thorne and Friendly Parsonage and the rest of them. I think the last one is like The Last Chronicle of Barset. And like, I don't know, I just want to read that dramatic things. And I am connected to these characters. And I also have The Way We Live Now, which is a book I've had on my shelf for like 5 years now. And I do really want to read, but I've now gone into the other one. And it's about a financier and his life. And I think he did fraud. I don't know. And then we have his other ones, which is the Pallister novels, beginning with Can You Forgive Her, which is a book that Past It Classics read. And I love all of them and I love their discussions. If you want to read classic books, I love it. I love it so much. And their debate, so I know pretty much everything that happened in that book or like discussions around it, but it only intrigued me more. I didn't want to go through all of like the grands right away. So I kept you guessing, and now we're going on to the Bronte, specifically Charlotte Bronte, because I've only read Jane Eyre so far and I liked it. I also think it was incredibly racist and ableist as well. So yeah, I have still so many conflicted thoughts about that book. And the second half was also quite boring. But the first half was really good. Conflicted thoughts about Jane Eyre just exist. And I read about a third of Wuthering Heights. Me and my roommate were reading it together and dramatically going through it, and then we got distracted, and I think I'm just gonna read it on my own now, but it's been a year, so that's my story with Wuthering Heights. I don't think it's gonna even get up to the margins of Jane Eyre, but we'll see. The book that I really want to read and that I've been waiting to finish Wuthering Heights, and even though it's like the book I've been most psyched about at all, is The Tenant of Wildfell Hill by Anne Bronte, because I think Anne Bronte is gonna be my girl. Like, I've read some of their poetry as well, and I like her poetry the best. She's the softest voice, and this book deals specifically with a woman who runs away from her abusive husband and goes to this like Wildfell Hill, and she's a tenant and stuff like that, and no one knows anything with her, and she's with her son. And I love books that deal with the ways in which, like, you know, women are mistreated by the world, and then the ways in which they receive punishment or they receive, you know, disgrace for doing things that are like help them survive. I think it's the book that I'm going to enjoy the most by any of the Bronte sisters, but I'm working my way through. And then we also have Villette and Shirley, especially Shirley seems really fascinating to me. And then we also have The Professor, all by Charlotte Bronte, which I will eventually read probably. And then we have their collected poems, because I've only read a handful and I would love to, especially Anne's poetry. I think she's lovely. And then we only have a few left, and thank you so much for joining me on this, because I don't know, I'm having fun. So next we have The Romance of a Shop by Amy Levy, and this is proto-feminist. It's about two sisters whose father died and they decide to open a photography shop, which is awesome. I want that. So, and then we have Olive by Dinah Marie Mullock Craik, which is a handful of a name, and I know primarily that she is a disabled heroine, and she was disabled from birth, so her family never really wanted her to, you know, be a lady of society and stuff, so it actually allows her to have a lot more freedom and a lot more world. And as someone who has a disability myself and has to reconfigure the ways in which I go in society and the way people perceive me and stuff, I think this is a book that's going to be incredibly emotional, but also really good, and I'm super psyched for it. And then our last author, which we have multiple things, and our last author altogether is George Gissing. Gissing? Should have probably learned that beforehand. But we have New Grub Street, which looks at the literary world and society. It's called a microcosm, and it's like a journalist and a novelist and all of their things and like whether they should tell the truth. We have The Odd Woman, which is social realism about these people and about their sisters and who have to like work and, you know, work a lot of jobs and stuff like that, and the ways in which, you know, we don't talk about it. I feel like it's similar to The Diary of the Nobody, where we have characters who are not often the ones that shed light on in the world. And these are the books that I'm super, super excited to read the next 10 years, 5 years, 50 years, I don't know, however long I live. Like, I'm a person who like super, super loves to like, you know, be like, I read this book, because like not only like from a like that's a cool thing, but like, I don't know, I like history. I like being like, I understand this because I've like lived in it. But I also realize I can't do that in every single circle. So like, I won't read every book I read. I won't read every book on the shelf probably, even if I live another 50 years. However, that does not keep me from wanting to like explore and want to look in and like think about doing that. I don't know. Let me know what your approach is to books and reading. I have like a much more lenient read when also wanting to consume everything. That is kind of my vibe these days, and it will probably change again, but happy reading and writing, and I will see you next time with a list of books that is too big.